Hi guys. Okay, so I'm going to try to add some video to this. I always talk too much and the files are too big, so I'm going to do my best to like break it all up. Okay, the first thing that we need to do in order to figure out what this essay by Foucault is to figure out what the context for it is. And the context for it is that it's actually a response to a previous essay called The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, which I did not make you read, but I'm going to give you the highlights of. In 1968, Roland Barthes makes his move from being a kind of structuralist, cultural anthropologist, writing things like on the semiotics of wrestling and cool stuff like that. And then he gets very interested in the work of people like Jacques Derrida, and he sort of makes his move to post-structuralism, and he writes the Death of the Author. And he writes a lot of other really, really interesting things, but that's one of the essays. And so what Barthes is doing in The Death of the Author is he's critiquing new criticism. Remember what new criticism is? And at this point I'd say, what was new criticism again? And you'd all be like, oh, I can't remember. And then somebody would be like, oh yeah, no, I remember. That's that idea that the critic, that the text, we don't have to worry about what the author intended. We don't have to worry about what the reader, the sort of amateur reader, feels about the text, like impressionism. It's anti-impressionistic, and really like all of this stuff, like you need expert critics who can tell you in no uncertain terms what the text means, right? And it's like very formalist, and it's basically the guiding principle, the guiding methodology for first-year English classes, right? So which is why we didn't cover it much, because you're kind of all familiar with it. So just cast your mind back to all of that discussion we have way at the beginning. So that's what Barthes is responding to in his essay. And what he wants to say is in The Death of the Author is that even though the new critics claim to not care about author's intention, right? Remember that term, the intentional fallacy, like we shouldn't even think about what the author's intention was because authors don't know what they're talking about. In fact, Barthes, what he's pointing out is that new criticism is still kind of implicitly tied to the idea of there being one true meaning for each text, right? And even if the author doesn't know what he's talking about, he or she is talking about, the critic will be able, through careful work, through careful critical work, to actually reveal the meaning of the text, right? He's like, no, what that does is that still ties a text to an author. And what he says is it seeks to impose a limit on a text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing. And you notice the use of the term signified there. That's like that, what Barthes is criticizing is the sort of like current idea, or this sort of persistent idea that writing has a final meaning, right? And so here, this is a version of the author, or the critic's reading of the author, which becomes a kind of transcendental signified. And he says, like, that's nonsense, because what that does is that closes writing, it closes interpretation. And so what he proposes instead is that, it's true that we don't need the author is dead, but where meaning lies is within the reader, right? So he says a text is made up of multiple writings, and there's lots of stuff in them, and texts are made out of lots of other texts, and there's only one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that's the reader, right? It's the reader who will see things in the text, will be able to see more in the text because the reader will have read a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And the reader will be situated in his or her own context, and therefore, the reader's every new reading is possible because, all meaning is situated with the reader. So that's what Barthes says. Like, that's a very kind of overview of what Barthes says in his essay, The Death of the Author. And that is what Foucault is immediately responding to. Okay? All right, that's little video number 1.